Welcome to the American Voter Project of the Eric H. Holder Jr. Initiative for Civil and Political Rights. We have an all-star panel tonight, and I know that all of you students and faculty are very much looking forward to this conversation. The topic for this panel, which is our 15th installment, will focus on the road ahead for the Department of Justice. With the confirmation in March of Attorney General Merrick Garland, and especially in light of General Garland's first congressional hearings yesterday, where he set out his vision and his priorities, it seems like the perfect time to reflect on the future of the Department of Justice under the new administration. You'll have read today all over New York Times and everywhere about the hearings yesterday, where General Garland set out his vision for a Biden administration Department of Justice, promoting the Biden priorities of combating domestic extremism, racial inequality, environmental degradation, and gender violence. He discussed his $35.2 billion budget request, which is an 11% increase from last year. And we're joined to discuss all of this by, as I mentioned, an all-star panel, 4 extraordinary attorneys and thinkers who bring a wealth of experience, 2 as former attorney generals, and also bring different perspectives now from where they stand. So first, I'd like to welcome back, of course, Attorney General Eric Holder, who's our namesake for the Eric Holder Initiative for Civil and Political Rights here at Columbia University. General Holder was the 82nd Attorney General of the United States and the 3rd longest serving Attorney General of the United States. And he served overall in government for more than 30 years under different administrations appointed by Presidents Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, each time confirmed by the US Senate. And of course, as everyone knows, he is coming home to Columbia, Columbia College 73, Columbia Law School 76. So we're really thrilled to be back in conversation. Eric, thanks so much for being here.
All right. Good to see you, Bernard.
Good to see you. We'd also like to welcome Mayor Jenny Durkan, who is mayor of Seattle. Has been mayor of Seattle since 2017. Mayor Durkan served as U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Washington from 2009 to 2014. And Mayor Durkan's been a longtime civic leader and advocate. She was the first citizen observer of Seattle Police Department's Firearm Review Board and served on 2 committees pushing for reforms at the Seattle Police Department. She helped establish the drug and mental health courts in King County and created a specialized federal program to provide treatment alternatives to incarceration. And her focus as mayor of Seattle now is to make Seattle more affordable and inclusive for all. Thank you, Mayor Durkan, for joining us. I also want to welcome back Attorney General Sally Yates, who was both former Deputy Attorney General and Acting Attorney General of the United States, who's now a partner at King & Spalding in Atlanta in the Special Matters and Government Investigations. And Sally Yates has had 27 years in the Department of Justice, rising through the ranks, becoming U.S. Attorney in Atlanta, Georgia. And then Deputy Attorney General, then of course Acting Attorney General. And as Deputy Attorney General from 2015 to 2017, Sally Yates was responsible for crafting and implementing initiatives focusing on many of the DOJ's priorities, including corporate fraud, cybercrime, gang violence, civil rights, financial crime. And she led DOJ's criminal justice reform efforts as well. So welcome back, General Yates. It's nice to have you back on our program. And then we'd also like to welcome back Neal Katyal, who is a friend of the program and of the initiative and has been with us before as well. Neal Katyal is the former Obama administration acting Solicitor General of the United States. He's currently a partner at Hogan Lovells, where he runs one of the largest Supreme Court practices in the world. He's argued over 40 cases before the United States Supreme Court. with 37 of them in the last decade. So he is quite experienced at arguing before the court. He's also a law professor and colleague at Georgetown University Law Center, where he also serves faculty chair of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection. And of course, he's also the author, most recently, of the New York Times bestseller, Impeach, the Case Against Donald Trump. So thanks, Neal, for coming back with us. I think combined, we have more than a century of experience at the DOJ here on this panel. So it's really incredible. And Eric, I know that we've been talking a while about having this panel to get a sense of the future of the Department of Justice. We were planning to have it in March, and then because of the student union strike, we postponed till now. Of course, things change rapidly. Of course, and now, of course, it couldn't come at a better time because of the hearings just yesterday, which I'm sure you were watching and following along.
Well, it is. I think it is an opportune time for us to be talking about where the Justice Department is going. This is, I think, a chance for Justice Department renewal. It's not only. I think we should not only focus on what has happened, what Merrick Garland says he's going to do with the Justice Department, the direction of the Biden Justice Department. We've also heard the news about what happened to the prior Attorney General and things that have happened there in connection with some, in connection with his duties. And so I think, we don't need to focus on that, but I think that in some ways shapes what happens with this Justice Department. My guess is that it will be kind of a return to normal, in the sense that a lot of the things that have always defined how justice departments operate, for instance, how they interact with the White Houses that they are partners with, we'll see something that is more normal there. But I also think that you're likely to see, as we have seen in the Biden administration kind of writ large, a more progressive agenda than perhaps people would have expected. And so I think that when it comes to questions of race especially, I think we're going to see the department in a more progressive, taking more progressive stands than I think we might have expected. So I think it's going to be an interesting time for for DOJ to get back to normal, and then to build upon that which I know the president and the Attorney General want to do.
Yeah, I think that's right. And we'll come back to some of that, and particularly to questions of race in a moment. What I thought we would start by doing is, now, of course, we heard General Garland's priorities and vision yesterday, but I think it would be helpful to just get a quick check from each one of you, since you've had so much involvement with the department, to get your sense of what, at this particular moment in time, you would view as a priority for the Department of Justice. I mean, another way to say this is, apart from investigating and prosecuting the January insurrection and the insurgents there, what would you think are the most important things, in part, that Garland was talking about yesterday, but that we should be focusing on in thinking about the department in the coming years? Maybe we'll start with you, Mayor Durkan, for the view from the from your position as mayor, really, in a locality, right, situated, having been at the Department of Justice before, looking at it going into the future.
Yeah, thanks. And first, let me say what an honor it is to be here, and particularly to be with this group of august generals that I'm with. I would say that, the months since the Biden administration has taken office, it could not be more different for cities across America. Not only are we not antagonistic with the federal government, but we now are seeing a federal government that is looking at not politics, but what are the shared goals to serve the American people and our residents. And that mayors usually deal with HUD and HHS, Department of Labor, Transportation, but the Department of Justice is going to play a critical role in the health of American cities in many ways. And I think Attorney General Holder really highlighted the issue of race that cuts across so much, but we saw it in the last year acutely in cities that we know we are going to need work and guidance in a collaborative relationship with the Department of Justice on things like policing and civil rights. So critical to so many cities across America, particularly coming out of the protests against police last year and what we've seen across America. Voting rights and are critical not just to cities, but to our nation in setting that even playing field. And white collar criminal prosecutions, which I think had fallen off, I think when we're dealing with an atmosphere of trying to have overcome the disparities and economic disparities to create an even playing field, Department of Justice has a critical role there. And then finally, across every city, I'm talking to mayors on a weekly basis. The rise in gun violence in every major city in America is something that there's going to need to be a relationship with the Department of Justice. And just in the last weeks, I and a number of mayors of the major cities, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, sent a letter to the Department of Justice asking them to take some actions on a convening on some of these issues, because we desperately need federal leadership, collaborations and partnerships.
Great, thank you, Mayor Durkan. That's great. That sets out a few issues that we're going to be talking about today: policing and civil rights for sure, and voting rights, as well as white collar and gun violence, which we're going to get to today. Let me turn to you, Sally Yates. You were heading the department as well, so you had your own priorities. You've seen where things have gone over the past few years, and now with Merrick Garland's priorities, what do you see as being really important we need to address?
Well, first, let me also thank you for the invitation. I'm honored to be here today as well. But I have to say, I don't think that 10 days as acting attorney general buys me the moniker of general for life. So I think I could just go with deputy attorney general. But I'm really glad to be here with my friends today to talk with you about these important issues. You know, Jenny just mentioned, I think, what some of the challenges and priorities of the department going forward. And when I think about DOJ's mission, I really think of it in the context of the framework of our nation's foundational promise of equal justice. And, you know, that's a promise I think we have to acknowledge that we have never fully lived up to from the time of our founding, when we declare all men are created equal, at the same time that we're enslaving hundreds of thousands of African Americans, to today, where you see voter suppression efforts already all across the country. So I think that the department is at a moment of our nation is at a moment of real reckoning on racial justice. And the other side of that equal justice coin, I think of, is the rule of law, and our promise that the laws apply equally to everyone, that no one is above the law, and that the power of the Department of Justice of the state is not going to be used to go after political enemies or to protect friends. And when I think about the racial reckoning, you know, that's not something that falls just to the Department of Justice. It's bigger and broader and deeper than that. You know, it goes to those issues of generational lack of access to education and to economic opportunities. But there's a big role for DOJ to play as well. And Jenny already mentioned, you know, civil rights, and Eric had mentioned a reinvigoration of our civil rights department at DOJ, including everything from voting to excessive force cases to, importantly, Attorney General Garland's already announced 2 pattern and practice investigations to deal more systemically with police abuse. But beyond that, it's also really meaningful criminal justice reform. You know, this was Eric Holder's baby. I mean, he did so much in advancing that during the time that he was Attorney General, and there's still more to do. And it's everything from addressing cash bail and bonds that falls disproportionately on people of color, to, again, meaningful sentencing reform, to addressing the crack powder ratios. You know, it's 18-1 now, but it should be 1-1, and DOJ can address that internally. But beyond ensuring that people of color are treated fairly, I think it also means the nation's promise of equal justice and DOJ's responsibility for that means making sure that people of privilege are held to account. And that's why when Jenny mentioned white collar work, she's absolutely right about that. That's something that was not really a priority of the last administration, but absolutely should be part of this, along with environmental justice and ensuring, well, actually environmental cases at all would be an improvement over the last administration, but particularly addressing those situations where communities of color have been required to bear a disproportionate brunt of environmental matters. And then sort of the flip side of that coin, to me, is actually the easier side of this, and that is restoring public confidence in the rule of law and in the separation of the White House and the Department of Justice and criminal cases and individual investigations. And that's resurrecting the wall, that's respecting the career men and women of the Justice Department again, and leadership comporting itself in a way that sends the message to the American people that cases are being decided on the facts and the law. And then the final thing quickly is adapting to today's challenges, which includes the rise in domestic terrorism and extremism, particularly white supremacists, but also includes other things like cybercrime and new national security threats, so that the department is building the infrastructure to address those before the wolf is at the door.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Sally. That's a lot more on our table, so we've got a lot to talk about. We're going to get to the voter suppression issues, environmental that you raised, and also the separation, separation of the White House and DOJ, which I was going to get to with Eric at the top there. But I want to bring in Neal Katyal before we go back to Eric Holder and get your sense of priorities, and particularly with the focus on kind of the Solicitor General's office and how to negotiate with the docket of the Supreme Court.
Thanks. Well, first of all, what a privilege to be with this group of people. I mean, you all are the conscience of the law and some of the greatest lawyers and public servants I know. So it's a real honor to be on this with you all. To me, Bernard, I don't think actually it's about any particular policy or position. I think there are any number. Sally's identified a bunch, and the Solicitor General took a lot of nutso positions in the last administration, and we'll talk about that. But to me, the issue is more primary, it's more tonal, it's more cultural. And really, you can just see it in yesterday. I mean, yesterday was a tale of two attorneys general. One, Garland, who was responsible, balanced, kind of embodying the historic promise of the Justice Department. And then secondly, you had an opinion from Judge Amy Jackson in DC about Bill Barr and his shenanigans around the Mueller report, in which he called him disingenuous and all sorts of stuff, which is, really pretty remarkable to have a sitting judge say about any litigant, let alone the Attorney General of the United States. And I think, the most important thing that we already see happening is that the Attorney General is acting like the Attorney General of the United States, not the Attorney generally for the President. And, Bill Barr, there was always a degree of, frankly, corruption around him. He constantly acted like one of Donald Trump's personal attorneys. And I think with the decision yesterday, with attention being given to this, he's now being treated like one of the gang, like one of Trump's attorneys, all of whom are facing basically some sort of criminal investigation or the other. And I think, what Garland does is he brings the department back to its kind of historic roots. I mean, the Justice Department's not like, some other departments like Interior or something like that, which has been plagued by scandals in different administrations. The Justice Department's been above reproach, and Barr really spit on that. And that is a very dangerous thing. I mean, the department should have, for example, a zone of privacy over their decision-making. It shouldn't be that everything is subject to FOIA. But when you have someone like that in place, that rot means federal judges have to do more and more. Mm-hmm. And so just the last thing I'll say is, President Biden did exactly the right thing in putting someone like Merrick Garland in. I mean, Merrick Garland is not the type of person you put in if you want some attorney general lackey of the Bill Barr, school. Garland's the reverse. And so, I'm optimistic about the return of cultural norms to the Justice Department.
Great, thanks so much, Neal. Let's start there actually. And so I want to go back to you, Eric Holder, on this. I want to talk about the independence of the Attorney General versus the White House, but I also want to get a sense of what it is exactly. What is this independence that we're talking about? So I agree, Neal, that there's the question of kind of issues of corruption and issues of acting as if you are the president's attorney rather than the Attorney General. But at the same time, right, Merrick Garland is putting forth priorities that represent the Biden administration priorities. So, I mean, it's not as if the Attorney General is in some sense not also informed by the priorities of the White House. So what is that line, Eric, between of independence, really, at the same time, of independence at the same time as promoting a political platform, in a sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a line that has to be understood. I mean, the reality is that the Justice Department is different, as Neal says, than other cabinet agencies. I remember during my confirmation process, Senator Pat Leahy said, "You understand, you're going to be the Attorney General. You're not going to be the Secretary of Justice. There's a difference, and you're different than other cabinet members." And I think that that's true. At the same time, you're a part of the president's team, for lack of a better word. You want to support the agenda of the president, and how Justice Departments manage those sometimes competing things really defines, I think, good Justice Departments, bad Justice Departments, good AGs, and bad AGs. I think it's pretty interesting that Merrick Garland, from what I've heard, what was reported, picked the same 4 portraits to put up in the conference room on the 5th floor. Every Attorney General gets to pick 4 of his or her predecessors and put their portraits up in the conference room. He picked the same 4 that I had: Kennedy, Levy, Jackson, and importantly, Elliot Richardson. And I had Richardson up there to remind me that, there had to be that distance, and that at some point you may have to take a position inconsistent with what your president wants you to do, and it may end up costing you your job. And Elliot Richardson was there to remind me, of that fact. I think Edmund Levy, it was there, and I think probably Merrick would say the same thing, to talk about how he rebuilt the Justice Department after the Watergate scandal. So again, that recognition that you're part of the team, but only to a certain degree, and you have to come up, well, Sally and Jenny will remember this. There's a thing called a contacts policy. Who actually can speak from the Justice Department, and who can they speak to at the White House, and about what? I have no idea whether the Trump administration had a contacts policy, and if they did, I'm sure that they probably violated it. But that's something, these little kind of infrastructure things that are extremely, extremely important. So independent, but part of the team, and how you manage those competing interests is really what defines a Justice Department.
Yeah, but I take it that there aren't. You said infrastructure, which is interesting, because what we're dealing with are norms more than structures, it seems to me. I mean, I think that's what we realized under the Trump administration. I mean, if there was one thing that we realized under the Trump administration, it was that this country is often guided more by norms than by actual enforceable rules, right? And we saw that time and again. Would there be ways to institutionalize more independence or separation? And the reason I ask, in part, is kind of like to be the devil's advocate. You were talking about going against the president. Well, Barr did at the end, right, when he said there's no evidence that this was a steal, right? I mean, so at the bitter end, he did, in a way, go against the president, and for which ultimately he departed and was relieved. But even there, again, there aren't kind of there aren't formal structures here. Are we just gonna have to continually depend on norms being followed in some way? Do you think, Eric? And then maybe I can get Sally on this too.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, there are structural things that could be put in place. There are ways in which you can put regulations in place. I mean, Neal was the one who came up with he wrote the special counsel regulations, and so, you could put, a Neal at it and have him draw up, regulations. But the reality also is that, even if you put regulations in place, it's really up to the people who occupy those offices to follow, those regulations. I mean, at the end of the day, it comes down to who are the people who occupy the positions of responsibility, and will they be true to norms, to our values, to what's expected of people who are on the 5th floor where the AG sits, on the 4th floor, where the deputy attorney general says, well, where the solicitor general says, well, where a U.S. attorney sits. Are you going to have people who understand, how this thing of ours, how this Justice Department of ours is supposed to work, and look back and understanding that we got great examples of, Justice Departments that were run correctly and Justice Departments that, did things, in very, very wrong ways. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think you can come up with a list, and you can put regulations in place, but that we should not get, ultimate comfort from the fact that it's written down, as opposed to it being a norm.
Right. Well, the question would be, how would it be enforceable? How would it be enforceable? I mean, even if we wrote those rules down. Yeah. Sally Yates, let me invite you to jump in on this, both in terms of thinking about how we would go about enforcing those separations, and then also within. I wanted to ask you, within the department, whether you think that there should be any kind of structural changes that you could envision. In part, I'm interested in this because you mentioned as one of the priorities, one of the important priorities, the work on civil rights. And I was noticing in the statement that Garland gave that that there's $209 million for the Civil Rights Division, and that was a total of $209 million for the Civil Rights Division, which actually in a budget of $35 billion seems kind of small, although there's a lot in this budget, including FBI and DEA and whatnot. But do you think that there should be? Do you envisage that there should be structural reforms both outside with regard to the White House, and then whether there need to be any within the department to kind of carry forward some of the vision that the Biden administration wants to see happen?
Yeah, well, first, let me say I couldn't agree more with Eric with respect to the point about how ultimately it comes down to the people. I do think that, perhaps there are some things you could do to beef up the contacts policy or to add some transparency provisions. I know that that's been one of the recommendations from some, so that contacts are identified. But, ultimately, it really does come down to the character of the people in leadership positions there. And even if it's in a regulation, if you have someone, particularly at the top of the Justice Department, who is going to ignore a policy, that person is likely to ignore a regulation as well. Similarly, if you have a president who's inclined to do that. So while I think it's a good thing to focus on the contacts policy and as I said, perhaps to refresh it, I think you need to make sure that you've got people that you trust in these positions. In terms of whether something needs to be done internally with respect to maybe sort of the interaction with the White House, sometimes I get a little frustrated when I hear that the Department of Justice was politicized. The department wasn't politicized. The president was, and some of the leaders at the Department of Justice were, but the career men and women at the Justice Department had their heads down and were trying to do their jobs. And it's really up to the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General to protect them from any interference from the White House or the Hill or any other place where there's inappropriate attempted interference in the business of DOJ. Now, with respect to carrying out the president's priorities, there's a big difference between interference in specific investigations or cases versus the president's priorities. It's entirely appropriate. In fact, not just appropriate, Attorney General Garland should be directing the resources of the department to fulfill the president's priorities. But the president shouldn't, and I'm confident President Biden will not have his hand in individual cases or investigations.
So that's the most troubling case, right? When I take it, the notion of corruption that we were talking about earlier with Eric, and let me turn to Neal on this, and then I'll go back to Mayor Durkan when we go right into kind of like the policing issues and the issues we're going into. I take it the biggest problem, the biggest evidence of corruption was when there was White House interference with a decision to investigate, or with a decision to prosecute, or dropping the case against, against a particular individual, say. Is that so? Neal, would you say that was the biggest problem in terms of the breach of the conventional independence?
So both the decisions to prosecute as well as the decisions not to prosecute. So I think it went in both directions. So the president was a shield protecting his friends like Roger Stone, Manafort, all those people. And he was a sword urging the department to go after his enemies. Now, I will say to the modest credit of the people who ran the Justice Department in the last administration, they didn't actually take the president up that much, maybe perhaps at all, we don't know, on that. And, like prosecuting Hillary Clinton and, things like that. It may be that there were instances that we don't know about yet, but none of that happened. And I think the problem here is that it's very hard, and Bernie, you were getting at this, but it's very hard to basically write a set of rules that's enforceable. We actually kind of don't want that. And indeed, our constitutional system may prevent that, because Article 2 gives the president and the attorney general pretty much the unlimited prosecution power. So they could structure it so that the president is consulted on every prosecution decision. But for the best of reasons, going back to Sally's initial point about justice being blind and even-handed, nobody in their right mind would want such a system. At the same time, sometimes you want to have the ability of the executive branch to provide input, even in a prosecutorial decision. I mean, my first job at the Justice Department was working for Eric when he was Deputy Attorney General, and one of his assignments to me was to think about the contacts policy. And one of the things we realized, and I think it's been enshrined in every version of the contacts policy, is that sometimes a prosecution can have major foreign policy consequences. So you don't want it to be just that the US attorney in Seattle or Atlanta, no matter how good they are, they may not be able to see all of the different diplomatic consequences that the State Department sees, or the White House and National Security Council sees. So under a very limited set of circumstances, you might allow some information to flow to the White House. But it's not about politics. It's not about who your enemies or friends are, as it was in the last administration.
So does this mean, Neal, that we can't write regulations on this? We have to stick with a norm-based approach?
No, not at all. I think we can write regulations or policies like the White House contacts policy. It's just that we have to recognize that ultimately, I don't think that they can be enforced with the power of law behind them. That is, any regulation that the Justice Department writes, including the special counsel regulations, can always be superseded by another attorney general decision. That's the essence of our constitutional system. And the way to deal with that is to create some transparency if there is a departure. I mean, my concern about what happened in the last administration is that you had policies like the White House contacts policy, or even the special counsel regulations, that were blown off sub silentio with no discussion, no awareness, no reporting to Congress or to the American people about what happened. But that, unfortunately, is the best we can do. I think if we were to try and actually write enforceable rules, we could actually, but they'd be unconstitutional, perhaps, and they also may straitjacket in administration that, you may not be able to foresee everything when you're writing a policy.
Right. Okay, great. Thanks. Right. So guidelines that wouldn't be enforceable, but that somehow we would try to hold people accountable to, in a way. Jenny, Mayor Durkan, let me turn to you now, and let's focus on some of these issues. The first one being policing, which is very important in the relationship between the state, localities, and the Department of Justice. So in terms of traditional Department of Justice, there are investigations. Eric Holder had the investigation of the Ferguson Police Department, and there's also consent decrees that regulate police departments. In the proposal, in Merrick Garland's proposal, there's a lot of money that's going to be going to community policing, I noticed. So 1.2 billion, an increase of 304 million to community-oriented policing and addressing systemic inequities. So how do you think, what's the best way to do that? What is the best way to address systemic inequities in the policing context through the Department of Justice?
So I think it's multi-leveled, and I want to go back to just a little bit and just say Eric is being a little too modest in terms of his role for setting a culture at the Department of Justice in response to your previous question. When Sally and I were U.S. attorneys and we first were able to meet with the president, brought to the White House with all the U.S. attorneys, with the Attorney General Eric Holder standing there, the president said, "You are not my lawyers. You are lawyers for the American people and for justice." And we heard that from Eric Holder. He was standing there because he felt it was an important message. And that's what was the culture for every U.S. attorney in every locality, which makes a difference. The Department of Justice is the only department in federal government with a moral value in its name. And that means something. And I think that we have to keep it, we have to preserve that and protect that and keep it from being buffeted by the political winds. You can be aligned with a president's policies and values, but not with the politics. And I think that we saw in the last administration was purely the politics. And now what we're seeing with policing is, I don't think there's probably a more important issue right now across every city in America. We have seen, as Sally said, if you look honestly at our history, that communities of color have been disproportionately impacted by the criminal justice system at every level. And it's a reflection of the disproportionate impacts of all the other systems of government. But nothing touches people's lives more powerfully than policing and the criminal justice involvement. And when we saw the protests last year rise up across the country, you can see how quickly trust in policing and therefore trust in government and the rule of law can dissolve, and how hard it is to regain that trust. I think the Department of Justice is going to be critical to regain that trust in rebuilding better policing for America. I know I joined with many mayors to say you have to do it at different levels. So first there's the high level. When Eric was Attorney General and President Obama were there, they convened a national hearing and forum and task force on policing. What are those 21st century policing principles that we need? We needed that desperately last year on a range of issues, but we need it desperately now too for the Department of Justice to take up where that baton was dropped and say, how do we get a different type of policing that's community-based, where when armed police are needed, they respond. But in many times, an armed police officer is not who is needed at a crisis call. Our police officers now deal with everything else that has gone wrong in society. And so the Department of Justice, I think, can set a role in what are some national standards for use of force, for community-based policing, for alternatives to policing, and then marshal all of the components and funding in the COPS office and U.S. Attorney's office to get behind those theories. But then they also have to go to the local level and bring those pattern and practice cases when they see it. I think I may be in a very unique position. As U.S. Attorney, I investigated the Seattle Police Department and signed a consent decree. And now as mayor, my police department is under that consent decree. So I've seen how it works and how it doesn't work. And I think that most of those consent decrees come by fundamentally agreements with the cities. And so having this collaborative effort to say, we know what we want to improve in policing. How do we get that right? And how do we bring specific departments in line with it? And then we have to use the civil rights laws, both the civil ones and the criminal ones, to look at those cases that are so egregious that locals don't prosecute for a reason. And the federal government has the power not just to investigate, but to prosecute and to really have individual accountability. So I think the Department of Justice is going to have to play three-tier chess. There has to be a national convening to talk about policing, both use of force and individual contact between police. But also, I think everyone would agree that during the protest, we saw that no city in America got it right, and how we responded to protests, peaceful protests. And those crowd management policies itself and the response of police, 100 cities use tear gas, for example, and you saw it play out night after night. Those also erode trust in policing and the rule of law. So they have to pay national level, some national standards. They have to play at the local level to really get at those departments that need to be reformed. But then they also have to have this strong collaborations with cities and local governments through the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Civil Rights Division to say, what are we really trying to get to? And how do we get there and how do we measure it? Because too often I think people say, we'll know it when we see it. That doesn't work because policing, like everything else, is iterative and changes. So I think the Department of Justice has a lot of work ahead of themselves. I'll throw one last thing out there. I think the burden of what you have to prove in a federal civil rights criminal case is too high. It makes it almost impossible to prosecute someone for violation of civil rights. And that's something that should be changed by Congress so that there is some strength to that. I know as U.S. Attorney, we investigated cases and one particularly egregious case, and we were unable to prosecute largely because that burden of proof was so high, you almost can't meet it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But this is really such a tough issue. I mean, one thing that it brings to mind is a somehow a cyclical structural problem with policing, particularly as they sit here in New York City, where it always seems to be the case that during kind of forms of protest, there's excessive police response. Certainly, we saw that this summer in many localities, a place like New York for sure. And then there's just it's almost like the battered wife syndrome in a way. There's kind of excessive response, and then there's contrition, and then there's a commission, and then there's ideas that we're going to change, and then there's an excessive response, and then there's contrition, and then there's an investigation, and here we just saw that in New York, where the inspector came out saying that once again, use of force was excessive. It's like, how do we get past that cycle, that constantly repeating cycle where we always have commissions that say really interesting and useful things, but then the problem arises again. I mean, is there a way to get past the usual kinds of I don't know, historical cycle? Does anyone want to try and address that? Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that we can try to put structures in place. The task force that we had in the Obama administration on 21st century policing laid out some really good standards to have great U.S. attorneys who interact with those 17,000 police departments around the country. To have an attorney general, perhaps, who uses the bully pulpit to talk about, values. But at the end of the day, as in most things in this country, it comes down to race. Why does this cycle keep repeating itself? Because the people who are victimized by unfair police practices are disproportionately people of color, and their lives don't matter. Their lives just don't matter as much. That's what the history of this nation. And unless we come to grips with those racial inequities, that disparate treatment based on race, the other stuff can make a difference, but that doesn't ultimately, I think, solve the problem. So it means asking some, some hard questions and facing some really difficult truths. It means understanding what our history is about, why there is that lack of trust between communities of color and people in law enforcement. And then you just got to go there. I mean, I got a lot of grief back in February 2009 when I said that, we were a nation of cowards because we are afraid to talk about race and confront racial issues. I read that speech just a couple of weeks ago. That thing's held up, pretty well. And all the grief that I got maybe was a little unwarranted. I think, well, how about it? It was very unwarranted. But that is, I think that's, unless we're willing to do that, and this is hard. This is not going to be easy. This is hard stuff. But unless we're willing to do that, I don't think you ever solve the problem of policing in this country.
Right. Yeah. No, that's really helpful. I mean, I think that's right. But it also raises the question of whether and how the Department of Justice is best situated to deal with the issue of race. In other words, one of the ways in which the department deals with the issue of race is civil rights litigation through the Civil Rights Division. For race discrimination but how else? I mean, what is that? But that doesn't seem sufficient or adequate somehow, because that too stays at a level of kind of, I don't know, litigation. Well, maybe one of the problems with that right now, of course, is the Supreme Court that we have right now in terms of, right? So in terms of, voter suppression, Sally, you were talking about voter suppression as being a key issue. I mean, how does one go about addressing that and the issue of race and voter suppression? How do we go about addressing, how does the Department of Justice go about addressing that now that it is facing a Supreme Court with its current composition?
Well, you don't just ignore it because you're pessimistic about your chances of winning. That's for sure. And I think you also look at legislation in Congress now that would address some of the issues that happened with the Shelby County case. So I don't think DOJ can do it alone, but I do think that DOJ needs to be a leader. And, I think Eric is exactly right that this moment demands, I think, honest conversation about race. And so when we talk about policing, it can't be just policing as if race is not at the heart of the issues here. There are other potential proposals out there that people have batted around, like whether there's an ability to be able to tie the grant-making functions of the department or the administration writ large to police departments actually adopting, for example, some of the recommendations from the 21st Century Policing Task Force. It's one thing to make really excellent recommendations, which that task force did, but unless the police departments adopt those, then they sit as good recommendations on a shelf. And so there are various ways to approach that, but I think there has to be a recognition. I agree with Eric that race is at the core of it.
Okay, all right. Neal, so issues of race are also related, I think, to, it's race and ethnicity and religion as well. I'm thinking of the Guantanamo case, the Ali case out of the DC circuit, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which basically held that the due process does not extend at all to Guantanamo. So the suspension clause does, but the due process doesn't extend at all. The Solicitor General just filed their response because it's up on cert at the United States Supreme Court. And they didn't take a different position than the prior administration on this. So actually, they're defending the position that there's no due process that extends at all. How does the how can the office work together in terms of its different parts, the Solicitor General and the Department of Justice. I mean, as part of the Department of Justice and Merrick Garland wanting to address issues of race and also of other forms of discrimination, Islamophobia, etc., and not change some of those policies like that.
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, just on the conversation that Eric and Sally were having, I agree that, conversation and kind of, getting to the heart of these issues is important, but I don't think we should just lose sight of DOJ's policy, particularly in the Civil Rights Division. I mean, if you just take last year, for example, at the same time as we had the BLM protests and all the horrific killings, what did the Civil Rights Division do about it? Nothing. Instead, what did they do? They filed a lawsuit against Yale for affirmative action. That's what this division was doing during all of this. So I totally think conversation and getting to the heart of the issue is important, but I also think just kind of common sense policies that I think any administration should support are important too. Now, with respect to the Solicitor General's office, I think the answer is complicated. The SG should not change its positions generally from one administration to the next. It gets its special credibility with the Supreme Court from being constant, and the long-term interests of the United States government generally don't change from one administration to another. So when I came in 2009 and I reviewed all the Bush administration policies, at that point we didn't change position in a single one. We ultimately did in one or two cases, but it was incredibly rare. And that's been the historical norm of every Solicitor General, to try and understand what is that long-term interest of the department and to vindicate that interest. And sometimes you have inputs that change, cabinet secretaries, different policies, the Affordable Care Act, things like that. That can inform that. But in general, you have the same policies from one administration to the next until the Trump administration. These folks came in and flipped the predecessor positions like candy, left and right. I think far more, if you add up all the past instances of every living SG combined, Trump would have probably done more in those 4 years than all the rest combined. And so that now poses a real dilemma for the Biden administration and for the acting Solicitor General, Elizabeth Prelogar, because she's schooled in the traditions of the office about not flipping position. But if you have a prior administration that flipped the long-term historic position of the department, what do you do? Right. Well, I think the answer is you flip it back to the long-term interest, even if it is formally a flip in position. And so, you will see, I think, the Biden administration, we've already started to see it, the Biden administration starting to change positions from the Trump administration and getting accused of, oh, you can't flip positions kind of thing. But what they're doing is restoring the long-term position. So just one very simple example of this. The Affordable Care Act case was argued in the Supreme Court a few months ago. The Trump administration came in and said, because of a tiny flaw in the act, the entire law, all 1,000+ pages, had to fall, even though there's a severability clause in the law. I don't think there's a Solicitor General, Republican or Democrat, frankly, anyone who's worked in the office, who would have thought that's the right position. Indeed, I was on a panel with Paul Clement in which he agreed with me. That was a crazy position, but the Trump administration came in and said the entire act had to fall. So Ms. Prelogar did exactly the right thing. She, or the other folks in the office, I think she was recused from it, but the career folks said, we're getting rid of that crazy Trump position. The entire act doesn't fall. And so I think we're going to see that play out time and again in restoring a baseline level of normalcy over Supreme Court advocacy by the federal government.
Yeah. But doesn't it create a problem, Neal, that in a way the Solicitor General has to maintain more of a steady course than the department as a whole, in a way? In other words, the department as a whole, I take it, for instance, on Guantanamo, could be following a path of trying to, empty Guantanamo. There are only 40 persons left at Guantanamo. Some of them have been approved for transfer since before Trump was elected. The department can take a very different tack on that But then what happens with the Solicitor General in the Supreme Court? I mean, how does that, how can that work really?
It's a very complicated dance, but I think it generally works well, at least when you have like normal people in those positions. So, like Eric Holder can say, I want Guantanamo to be largely emptied. And that's a policy decision. There's no legal problem with that unless Congress comes along and ties its hands, as they ultimately did. But that is fully within the prerogative of the Attorney General. It doesn't undermine the credibility of the Justice Department with the courts or whatever. But when you have an administration, as the Bush administration did, which said essentially Guantanamo is a legal black hole, and spent years and years arguing that to the court, it's very hard for a new Solicitor General to come in and say, oh, yeah, what's been being said for 10 years, just forget, or 8 years, forget about that. We didn't mean that. That's a hard thing to do because you have this, resource of credibility with the court that the Solicitor General is different than other litigants. They're not just out to win the case. They're out to give you a long-term perspective of what is good government. I'm not saying that, you can't ever meet that threshold. You can and do, but there should be, it's right that there are barriers to before flipping a position like that.
Eric, I want to hear you on this for a second before I turn back to Jenny to talk about gun violence for a minute, which is such a important topic right now. Any thoughts on this kind of the difficulty of navigating the course of the department with the continuity of the kind of litigation in front of the Supreme Court, basically?
Yeah, I mean, the department, you're always, I think what Neal said is right. You're trying to stay consistent. I mean, the Justice Department writ large is trying to stay consistent, trying to harmonize positions such that you don't want to overturn that which happened or which a previous administration did simply because it was inconsistent with a policy direction that you're taking. You try to harmonize them to the extent that is possible. But as Neal said, there are those rare instances where determinations have been made, where the Solicitor General, the Attorney General made a decision that they're going to have to take a different position. It's what happened with us when it came to defending the Defense of Marriage Act. We made that determination. That was a hard decision. That was a tough decision. It involved a lot of people in the department, and it was made tough by the fact that you don't want the Justice Department taking different positions in front of the Supreme Court simply because it is it's a new administration. I mean, like with regard to the thing we're talking about now, you can harmonize that. Yeah, as an Attorney General, I can say I want to close Guantanamo, but at the same time, maybe as uncomfortable as I feel, I can come up with ways in which I think the due process should not necessarily flow there, and you try to work through that in ways that you can.
Yeah, but why? I mean, why work through that or try to harmonize that? I mean,
well, I'm just using that as an example. It may
no,
be
I know.
And it may be that ultimately you make the determination that is so inimical to our values. I'm not saying that in this case, but it may be you reach a point where it's so inimical to our values that you say this is one of those rare instances where we've got a reverse position,
Or more common, as Neal was suggesting, in a case where you had a prior administration that was flipping wildly at the Solicitor General's office, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there has to be that recognition. I mean, what are you talking about? It's one thing to go from the Bush administration to the Obama administration, fundamentally different worldviews. And yet you want to try to harmonize those positions to the extent that you can. When you come in and you have an administration that doesn't pay any attention to those norms and really flips everything to the degree that Neal was describing, by flipping now, you're really just kind of getting us back to normal and getting us back to that which prior administrations had put in place.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, good. Let's turn then to gun violence. Mayor Durkan, you were talking about the rise in gun violence as being one of the things we should be focusing on. There's no doubt about that. What is the what is the relationship with from your perspective in Seattle, as mayor of Seattle? What are you looking for from the Department of Justice now?
Yeah, Bernard, before I answer that, I do want to go back to what Eric and Neal and Sally were just talking about. I think that if you look at the Solicitor General's office, the Supreme Court is kind of a governing influence on that. And that's one reason it doesn't tilt too much from administration to administration. But if you look at it in a broader sense, the cases where you do switch is when politics has overcome policy. And I think it's the reason why, you know, being in the Department of Justice, I'm very proud that we did change the position on Don't Ask, Don't Tell in the Defense of Marriage Act. Because if justice, if equal treatment under the law is home base, then that is what can guide you. And I think that's what has to guide the department writ large and the Solicitor General's office. And I think with gun violence, it goes back to what we've talked about here is this administration, we are at a pivotal point in our country. And we have got to acknowledge the role that race has played and how the American promise has been denied to so many people, particularly Black Americans. And that it was not a perfect union when formed, and we're trying to form a more perfect union, but it plays out across America and across every city in so many ways. And gun violence is one of those things. We are coming out of one of the most difficult years our country's ever faced. And if you get down to the city level, you had record unemployment, you had people isolated from one another, you had our economy shut down, you had, you know, a health emergencies, and the communities that were disproportionately impacted both by the health emergency and by the economic were, again, our communities of color. And so coming out of that, not having the structures we need in place to actually admit and deal with race and how it's played in access to opportunity, whether it's education or home ownership or healthcare. We have to acknowledge that. And I think Department of Justice has to play a critical convening role in that. And as the Department of Justice, they have to be at the forefront of recognizing how race has played in America, but particularly in our criminal legal system and our civil legal system and in voting rights. And you look across any of the institutions in America right now, and nobody being objective can deny that race doesn't play a fundamental role in the unfairness and inequity. And so the Department of Justice has to have that as a governing principle. And as they're looking in their 93 U.S. Attorney's Office on what to prosecute, how to prosecute, what sentences to ask for, how to enforce a civil rights law, they have to have hard baked into that a realization that to have an equal playing field, they have to recognize we haven't had an equal playing field. That doesn't mean politicization. It doesn't mean treating people differently. It just means being cognizantly aware that if you are the department who is tasked with the rule of law and enforcing the rule of law and promoting justice, that has to be the linchpin for your department.
Thanks for that. So let's stay on that theme. Let me go back to Sally Yates. I think that in your intervention, when you were talking earlier, you were talking about that the DOJ could address internally some of the discrimination, for instance, in sentencing. You were talking about crack sentencing, I think, where you were saying we could get to one-to-one internally. And how does that get done? And what are the other ways in which kind of the department could internally try to address some of the race discrimination in criminal enforcement?
Well, ideally, you would have Congress address the
Right.
crack ratios.
Right.
Let's assume that's not going to happen. You actually would follow the playbook that Eric put in place when he instituted the Smart on Crime charging policy. And you could, I mean, I had worked through all the details of this, but I think some folks are thinking about it. You could instruct prosecutors to, when they charge the quantities, which is what essentially Smart on Crime did, to charge the quantities in a 1-to-1 ratio, not an 18-to-1 ratio. So for it would be how the cases are charged. And in that instance, then you would be able to, by the manner in which you brought the charges, be able to address what the ultimate sentence would be. It's the exact same thing that when Eric tried to get sentencing reform through and couldn't get it through, and then addressed through the smart on crime charging policies, not charging quantities that would trigger mandatory minimum sentences unless that individual was the leader of an organization or was violent or some of the other criteria there. So it's not ideal. I mean, you'd rather have Congress address it, but you can't continue to let an injustice go on just because Congress won't act.
Right. Back to you, Eric, on this then. I mean, another thing that we've seen at some local levels in terms of internal district attorney, I think it was in Milwaukee, especially, are kind of internal reviews of the kind of racial impact of enforcement. I don't recall that being at the Department of Justice, but I might be wrong. Is that something that is that you thought about while you were Attorney General, and what were your and is that something that could be implemented?
Yeah, I mean, it was something that kind of really was the foundation for the Smart on Crime initiative that, that Sally and I put in place to look at, do a study of the federal criminal justice system and see where there were inequities. And, we got, people from the field, great U.S. attorneys, like Jenny, to share data and what was going on there, what charging policies that they had in place, what was the impact of those policies. I mean, we, for instance, in looking at just the data, were able to determine that white and Black defendants charged with the same crimes and controlling for their criminal histories, Black defendants were serving sentences 20% longer than their white counterparts. So you hear that, and then you try to come up with policies that will do away, to the extent the Justice Department can, have an impact on impacting those disparities. What is it that we can do by the way in which we charge, which cases we bring into the federal system as opposed to those that we leave in the state systems? A whole variety of ways in which the department can have an impact. But one thing I think is really critical is something I think that Sally said in her opening remarks. We should, this is obviously a very important conversation, but we should not delude ourselves into thinking that the Justice Department, or through the Justice Department, or through the criminal justice system, we're going to deal with all the inequities that we see in the nation. DOJ has an extremely important role, and you can put in place policies. There is the moral suasion that the Attorney General has, and using Merrick's using his ability to bring to the attention of the American people issues that it must confront. But it really has to be a whole of government effort, a whole of society effort to deal with a lot of these problems. I don't mean to minimize the role that the Justice Department can play and must play. The department must lead, because the department has unique powers that other cabinet agencies do not. So the department must lead, but you can't think that the Justice Department acting alone is going to solve these problems.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And on gun violence, Eric, what do you think? What are the principal ways in which the department can intervene here?
Yeah, again, as Sally said, congressional action is the best way. Putting in place, things like banning the possession of these semi-automatic weapons, these oversized cartridges, all of that stuff, all the things that the American people support overwhelmingly, but Congress, in the thrall, of the gun lobby, simply can't do. But the department can also do things. Who gets charged? If somebody is in possession of a gun while committing a crime, well, that may be one of the instances where the department really wants to bring, more serious charges. So the department can change, emphasize, bringing to justice people who use guns in the commission of crimes. That's a place where, an attorney general can decide to use the limited resources that he or she has to set a tone, set a policy that will have, can have a differential impact on something like gun violence.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, we've got a few questions rolling in, and maybe we should address those, bring those in. We've got one student who's asking about the defund the police movement. So this goes back to a conversation about policing. And the question is, do any of the panelists have any thoughts about how that could fit in the DOJ's agenda? Where shall I start?
All right, well, I'll be short. I'll be brief.
Go ahead, Eric.
As a marketing tool, the expression defund the police, really bad. I mean, that walked right into all the folks. That's a well-intentioned phrase, I get it. But that walked right, it was a gift to those who would, I think in a craven way, oppose that which reformers were really talking about. I mean, reimagining what police should do, I think that makes a great deal of sense. Jenny can perhaps talk about that better than anybody because, she has a police department that reports to her. But we ask an awful lot of our police to do things that maybe they're not necessarily as equipped to do. Why do armed police officers show up when somebody is in emotional distress? No indication that he or she is a danger to himself or others, but is acting out. But the notion of defunding the police, I mean, that phrase is one that I think is problematic, and I think is undermined. The reform efforts that I think really are at the heart of that phrase.
Although it did get to this idea that Jenny was talking about of, we conventionally use the police as first responders on everything, when in fact we should be using social workers or mental health experts or something like that in response. And it did create a nationwide debate around policing that I think was unprecedented in a way. So, I mean, I think we'd have to do a kind of a political science study or something to figure out whether it was strategically intelligent to use that language or not. Ultimately, obviously it plays into the hands of, right? But I mean, but everything plays into the hands. The question is strategically whether it kind of brought about, as did, abolish the police, whether it brought about a conversation or has changed kind of the conversation around policing in a way that could have some effects. What do the rest of you think? Neal, you're about to talk. Go ahead.
I think that, that strategically it was the wrong way to do this. There's ways to prompt that conversation without that. And, in particular, I don't know that the solution here is defunding the police. In some ways, the solution is superfunding them to the point where they learn about training, they get better use of force policies and the like, which does require resources. So the idea of like cutting them off or starting them, to me, just sounds antithetical. And you look at the success, for example, in Newark last year. In 2020, the Newark police didn't fire a single bullet, not one. And that's because of these kinds of programs and policies. So I think it's pretty dangerous to say, to use this kind of rhetoric.
Right. Jenny?
Yep. So I think that Seattle was my city council, 7 of the 9 members within a week of the protest starting pledged to defund the police by 50%. And we had a number of them who wanted to abolish the police. When you hear that, I think that there's both the literal and then there's the, what are people really getting at? And I think that what's really important for us to carry forward is this, is number one, if you look at the governmental institution that has fundamentally touched communities of color the most and changed their lives, it's the criminal justice system. And what we need to do is change, and Eric's exactly right, this isn't a DOJ role in the sense, by the time things get to DOJ, often so much has already gone wrong. What it means is we've got to make more robust those institutions to bring healthy community resilience, access to education, quality pre-K, job opportunity, healthcare, home ownership, those things that make a resilient community where police are needed less. At the same time, policing has to change, I think. I think that policing is one of the most dynamic professions you can have that is reacting to whatever is happening at that moment in the street but you have to be able to pull the camera back a little to see what's happening in a larger framework, whether it's a city or a state. And I think that Eric has it exactly right. I think what he said, what are those responses? In Seattle, Washington last year, we had over 17,000 crisis calls to 911 that police responded to. And one of the things under the consent decree was how did we respond? And the use of force has declined significantly under that consent decree. But at the same time, is it really what we want police officers to be doing? And I think if you put police officers and community around a table together and said, what are the calls we don't want police to be the front face of? They'd have a lot of agreement. People who are experiencing a significant emotional break or homeless encampments. And so we started a program in Seattle that we, modeled on what's Medic One, where we have someone calls 911 for those low acuity calls. Instead of police responding, we now have a trained medic, a firefighter, and a social worker. And they come, they stabilize the person, they get them whatever help. Maybe they need to go to the hospital, maybe they don't. Now, you can't do that in every case, cases where there may be potential for violence, cases where there's other things, but we can start to stand up other alternatives. But defunding the police without having those alternatives leaves nothing in a vacuum. And I don't think that's good for any city, any community. And so I think that we have to be honest that policing needs to change and needs to be more community responsive. But there are some times when you need a police officer and you need them right away when you dial 911. And so you can't just defund and abolish. You have to say, what are those situations we need armed police? How do we make sure they're trained, they de-escalate? And then what are the alternatives? And right now, we just don't have in any city in America those alternatives built robustly enough.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Another question that we have also regards policing and the protests, and and it's a question about trying to explain the change in or the reduction in the amount of protests going on right now compared to earlier. In part, I assume it has to do with the Chauvin verdict, but any other thoughts on kind of like where the trajectory and cycles of protests stand right now?
Bernard, can I go back to the gun violence question just for a second?
Sure.
I feel like there's one thing. I think that Eric and Sally are right that the Congress needs to take the lead, but there's a lot the Department of Justice, I think, can do that will be welcome. For example, I was really pleased to see Merrick Garland's proposed budget have more money for gun violence, because we know, for example, ATF has had its wings clipped in so many ways that it doesn't have the capacity, for example, to trace guns like they should, or to make sure that licensed firearm dealers are actually following the rules. And when I was U.S. Attorney, for example, we were able to track a lot of crime guns back to a particular dealer, having the ability to then take action against that dealer to make sure that there's not dealers who are just feeding the crimes. So I think the Department of Justice can do a lot, both in its enforcement, and then I think in its grant making can really help cities in those crime intervention programs with credible messengers and others to really get at some of the root causes of gun violence to begin with in the community.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And if I might just add to that, one other thing that the department can do is take litigating positions that support reasonable gun regulations. So for the last several years, I've been representing Hawaii in their challenge to the open carry laws that have happened. We couldn't go to the Justice Department and ask for help in defending their gun laws, which have been around since 1852. We know they would have laughed at us. But I think a new Justice Department, like most Justice Departments, and now there's a pending Supreme Court case on this out of New York, I think can come in and say, look, the Second Amendment, even if it does confer an individual right, it says well-regulated. And here's why regulations like Hawaii, New York, and other states are reasonable regulations. And here are the policy consequences that would unfold if you strike down laws like this. That's why it's well regulated. So that's stuff that the department has a unique voice on, because they can speak for law enforcement and speak for public protection.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Does anyone want to add anything on that one? I've got another question No? Well, good. All right. So there's also a question coming in about, well, it's more about corporate responses to the Georgia voting laws. And I think, I mean, the way I would style the question, I mean, the question is, what do you think about companies like MLB, NBA, Coca-Cola, et cetera, speaking out against the new Georgia voting laws? Should more companies be involved in voicing their opinions in politics? I just want to, since we're on the DOJ, really, the question might be rephrased here as, is that going to have more impact, say, than what could be done by the DOJ to challenge, say, the Georgia voting laws, if there are ways to challenge? In other words, this is something about kind of like, how do we achieve the more equal voting given the resistance and the changes in Georgia? Should we be looking to private enterprise corporations, and is that going to be more effective than what the Department of Justice could do? Maybe Sally Yates, you could deal with that problem in a way.
Look, I think that you need to attack it from every angle possible. And I was really glad to see that Coke and Delta and some of the others ultimately came out and made some really strong statements about the Georgia voting law. You know, I don't view this as, and I saw Mitch McConnell's statement, this is not a political issue. This is a fundamental right in our country. And I think it's really important for individuals and companies and everyone who can have an influence on legislators who pass these laws to speak up and to voice our country's values. And I view that as what is happening when these companies speak out. And the fact of the matter is that legislators factor this kind of thing in when they're thinking about how constituents respond, how some of their corporate supporters are responding. I think it's part of a company's civic duty on these fundamental issues like voting to take a stand.
Okay, great. Eric, do you want to add anything on that?
No, I think Sally's right, but I think the Justice Department can certainly play a role. I think, again, it's another one of these all hands on deck. You know, I mean, I'd sit down with Deputy Attorney General Yates, Solicitor General Katyal, talk to, you know, our great U.S. attorneys and figure out what is it the Justice Department can do in the protection of the right to vote. What are the kinds of cases that we can bring? What are the positions that we can take? How do we support, you know, I asked Neal, how can we support you know, a case that's on appeal? What is it that we can do there that will put the weight of the Justice Department, the weight of the Solicitor General behind an organization that is seeking to overturn, you know, these anti-democratic bills, you know, passed in Georgia and in other states. So yeah, I think the corporate voice is important, but the department, I think, has to find ways in which it can use its prestige and its power to be on the right side of our democracy.
Okay. All right. Final question having to do with the federal death penalty. And here again, I think it's a question of how does the department shift and change direction in a way. In part, I mean, going back, Neal, to the question about the Solicitor General's office, but maybe not so much, since obviously this would require in part legislation, but there's also enforcement decisions, actually, you know, going after warrants or not. So we have now the first presidential administration, the first president in the United States who has ever been abolitionist vis-a-vis the death penalty. I mean, it's a remarkable historical fact. There's never been an American president who's been opposed to the death penalty before. And President Biden, well, ran on that. That was part of the campaign and still maintains that. So we're in a remarkable historical moment. But the question is, of course, how does that translate, and how would it be envisageable to become the law of the land? Obviously, it would require some legislation, and there's a filibuster problem at the Senate. with regard to that. But then there are ways that the department, of course, could shift and no longer pursue death penalty cases, et cetera. What do you think about the prospects for that, Neal?
So first of all, I think, the death penalty at both the state and federal level is abhorrent. It's reprehensible that we do this. And we continue to do this in this day and age, and we're increasingly an outlier on the world stage. So I think one way or the other, the death penalty should go. Now, the problem with that for a Justice Department is, and it's a little bit the problem that Eric was referring to about Guantanamo, you don't want to necessarily tie a future president or future attorney general and take something off the table that you can't possibly envision all the circumstances and things that may unfold, war, and all sorts of things in days to come. And so that's why you have such reluctance to do something like that. I can tell you, for me, what I did when I ran the Solicitor General's office was say, in any death case, I want everything personally reviewed with weeks of time for me to make a decision. I insisted on just a crazy amount of process before taking a position in any death penalty case. But we didn't formally decide we're never going to pursue the death penalty. As you say, Bernard, there is legislation in Congress which authorizes the death penalty. It doesn't require it. And so the department formally has the power to just say, we're never going to do another death penalty case. And those people who are currently in, you can, make a decision not to enforce the punishment for those on death row. So I think they formally may have the power, even with congressional legislation. But that isn't really the ideal way that policy should be done. So I'd like to see the president and the attorney general promote a national conversation on this. And in the interim, insist on maximal safeguards, because the people who get the death penalty now aren't getting it for the worst crime. They're getting it for their worst lawyers.
Mm-hmm. All right, thanks. Yeah. I don't know, Eric, if you have any thoughts on that. I mean, that's interesting, Neal, because to a certain extent, it's almost as if that President Biden being opposed to the death penalty, I mean, what you're suggesting is shouldn't put in place something that would prevent another administration from returning to the death penalty in a way, if it felt necessary. But of course, if President Biden is truly against the death penalty, then that's part of being truly against the death penalty. It's for future generations as well, right? So there's a bit of a tension there in terms of what it means maybe to be opposed to the death penalty. All right. Well, this has been an absolutely fabulous conversation, and we are already past the time that we were supposed to stop. But I do want to give everyone the last opportunity just to say a word before we close. I know our students and faculty are extremely grateful for your time and for your thoughts. So maybe we'll start with Mayor Durkan, and then we'll go with Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates, and then Solicitor General Neal Katyal, and then Attorney General Eric Holder with just final closing thoughts. Jenny, you want to start?
Yeah, I would just say that I'm enormously hopeful. It's almost like I can have an exhale, because when you see the picture of Merrick Garland coming to the Department of Justice and being greeted by Monty Wilkinson, who was acting, Lisa Monaco getting confirmed, Vanita Gupta, we have professionals dedicated to the rule of law and justice now in charge. And you can see they know how it works. They know how to move the department and career people throughout the country pointed towards justice, and to fundamentally both protect the American people, protect the rule of law, but also to be able to do it in a way that is truly justice's home base. And so I think that there's enormous challenges. I think that this Attorney General will be challenged in ways that we can't even conceive of, particularly if Congress changes at the midterm. But even now, we're at a really difficult time in America. I think that there's strong winds buffeting from the left and from the right, and that's why the Department of Justice has to be manned and womaned by the people that are there now. And I'm enormously grateful for the people that are serving. And I just, again, want to thank Eric Holder. I think that he steered the Department of Justice in a way that placed it in history as this is how we do it right. And I hope we can get back to that and keep that course.
Thank you, Mayor Durkan. Sally Yates.
Well, I share Jenny's hope and optimism for the department going forward. She's also right that our country is at a real crossroads right now. And I think that the Department of Justice, while it can't do it alone, has a really important role to play going forward. And I have every confidence that both the leadership of the department and the career rank and file people who are equally happy, I think, to have an opportunity to be able to do their jobs the right way. You know, I felt grateful every single day of the 27 years that I was at DOJ, where my only responsibility was to seek justice. I remember that's how Eric would end every meeting, was go do justice. And I think that this is an opportunity now, both for the leadership to lead with that, but also for the career men and women to be able to live up to that responsibility.
Great, thank you, Sally. Neal, Katyal.
Personnel is policy. So the people like Garland, Lisa Monaco, Vanita Gupta, you know, that's showing real policy change. And it's also showing a cultural change. You know, Merrick Garland's going to leave at some point, and I can think of no better way to continue that work than to have the person who just spoke a moment ago, Sally Yates, replace him. So that's what I'm looking forward to. I'm optimistic.
All right, good, thanks. Eric, you want to close us out with some thoughts?
Yeah, you know, I think that I first want to thank, you know, Neal, Sally, and Jenny for joining us today. Bernard, you've done your usual superb job. I think this has been a rich conversation. I hope everybody enjoyed it and got something from it. You know, I think the Justice Department, as Sally said, you know, this has to be a whole of government effort, but the Department of Justice, I think, must lead. There is a moral component to the Justice Department that I don't think really exists, or at least to the same degree, in other parts of the government. And I would hope that the leadership of the department will meet this moment, this really unique moment in our history. We're asking questions about race that the Justice Department can impact. We're talking about criminal justice reform that the Justice Department can impact. We're talking about defending our democracy that the Justice Department can impact. And so the question is, and the hope that I have, is that the department leadership will meet, you know, this moment. You know, one of the questions I guess you were asking, or somebody was asking before about, you know, there's a decrease in the number of protests that we've seen. I hope that does not mean that what we've had is just a moment, you know, a moment in time, and now we go on to back to normal. I'm hoping that moment that we had in 2020 will lead to, you know, a movement. And I think the department has, you know, responsibilities, and it is constricted in certain ways. But, you know, you got to push against those limits. You got to push against, you know, some traditions sometimes to move the nation to that better place. I think we have leaders now who are capable of that. I hope they will find it within themselves to push themselves to force the department to be on the right side and to lead the nation, you know, in a real good way.
Great, thank you, Eric. All right, well, this has been a fabulous, rich, and theoretical, and I think multi-dimensional conversation. And I really want to thank you all for participating and for enriching us all of us at Columbia. I'm really, really deeply grateful. Thank you, Jenny Durkan. Thank you, Sally Yates. Thanks, Neal Katyal. Thank you, Eric Holder. And we will continue the conversation with lots of hope and expectations, right? Thanks a lot.